Some moments in life come down to a single choice: to reach out or let go, to trust a stranger or face the darkness alone. In the winter of 1882, Sarah Cole was dying on a frozen mountain trail in Wyoming when a quiet mountain man named Jacob Stern found her in the blizzard. He reached out his hand and said 5 simple words: "Take my hand. Trust me." She was a widow running from grief. He was a loner who'd forgotten what it meant to care for another soul. Neither expected to survive the night together, let alone what would happen in the days that followed. What unfolded between them in that white wilderness would change everything they thought they knew about second chances. Could 2 broken people find something worth living for in the most unforgiving place on earth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Sarah Cole had stood in the doorway of her Kansas farmhouse and watched them lower her husband into the ground. Thomas had been 34 years old, strong as an ox until the fever took him. It came on sudden. One day he was plowing the north field. 3 days later he was gone. The doctor said it was his lungs, an infection that spread too fast for medicine to catch. Sarah had sat beside his bed those final hours, holding his hand while he struggled to breathe, watching the man she'd loved since she was 17 fade like morning mist. The funeral had been well attended. Thomas Cole was respected in their community, known for his honest dealings and generous heart. Neighbors brought food, offered condolences, promised to help with the farm. But as the weeks passed and the casseroles stopped coming, Sarah found herself alone in a house that echoed with memories. Every room held some piece of their life together. The chair where Thomas read his newspaper each evening. The kitchen table where they'd planned their future over breakfast. The bedroom where they'd dreamed of filling the house with children, a dream that never came to pass. She'd tried to keep the farm running. God knows she tried. But working the land alone proved impossible for a woman who'd spent her days tending the house and garden while Thomas handled the heavier labor. The wheat Thomas had planted before his death came up thin and patchy. The livestock needed care she couldn't provide. Bills accumulated faster than she could manage them. By October, she knew the truth. She couldn't stay. Sarah had always been a practical woman, educated beyond what was typical for farm wives. Her father had been a school teacher before moving west, and he'd insisted his daughter learn to read and write with skill. She'd kept journals since childhood, filled pages with observations and small sketches of the world around her. Thomas had loved that about her. Her quiet intelligence, the way she saw beauty in ordinary things. He used to say she made their simple life feel rich. But after his death, she'd stopped writing. The journals sat untouched in a trunk. What was there to say? That she woke each morning wishing she hadn't. That the silence in the house pressed down like a physical weight. That she'd failed at the one thing she thought she could do, keep their life going without him. In November, she'd sold the farm, not for what it was worth, but for what she could get quickly. She'd packed a single trunk with her most essential belongings, purchased a sturdy horse and basic supplies, and pointed herself west. People asked where she was headed. She told them Colorado, maybe Oregon. The truth was, she had no destination in mind. She was simply leaving, putting distance between herself and the grave that held her past. The journey had been harder than she'd anticipated. Sarah had never traveled alone, never camped under open sky, never navigated by nothing but a rough map and the advice of strangers. But she'd pressed on, driven by the need to be anywhere but Kansas. She'd crossed into Wyoming territory in early December, following a trail that miners and trappers used to reach the mountain settlements. That's where her judgment had failed her. An old-timer at a trading post had warned her about winter travel through the high passes. "You don't want to be up there come mid-December," he'd said, tobacco-stained teeth showing through his beard. "Weather turns mean without warning. Folks get caught up there. They don't come back down." She'd thanked him for his concern and left the next morning anyway. She was tired of being warned, tired of being told what she couldn't do. Besides, it was only the 10th of December. She had time. She didn't have time. The blizzard hit on her second day in the mountains. One moment the sky was clear, the next it was white fury. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel her face numbing even through her scarf. Her horse, a reliable mare she'd named Penny, had panicked when the wind picked up. Sarah had dismounted to calm her, and in that moment of distraction, Penny had torn free and bolted back down the trail, taking most of Sarah's supplies with her. Sarah had called after the horse until her voice gave out, but Penny was gone. And suddenly Sarah was alone on a mountain trail with a bedroll, a small pack of food, and a storm that showed no signs of stopping. She'd tried to walk, but the snow was already knee-deep and rising. The wind cut through her layers like they were paper. Her hands went numb first, then her feet. She'd kept moving because stopping meant dying, but eventually her body simply refused to go further. She'd collapsed against a boulder, pulled her coat tight, and felt the cold begin to win. Her thoughts had grown fuzzy. She'd thought of Thomas, wondered if she'd see him soon. Part of her welcomed it, the idea of rest, of not having to carry the weight of grief anymore. That's when she'd seen him. At first, she'd thought he was a vision, some trick of the dying mind. A figure moving through the white curtain of snow, tall and solid where everything else was chaos. He'd approached slowly, cautiously, and when he got close enough, she'd seen his face, weathered and bearded, with eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single glance. He'd knelt beside her, those eyes taking in her condition with practiced efficiency. Frostbite on her fingers, hypothermia setting in, but still conscious. Still salvageable. "Can you stand?" His voice had been rough from disuse, like a tool left too long in the shed. She'd shaken her head. Speaking felt impossible. He'd looked at her for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Then he'd extended his gloved hand, palm up, an offering. "Take my hand," he'd said. "Trust me." Sarah had stared at that hand, thinking about trust, about strangers, about the choice between certain death and uncertain salvation. And then she'd reached out and placed her frozen fingers in his palm. His grip had been firm, sure. He'd pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness for such a large man, then wrapped his own heavy coat around her shoulders. "There's shelter close," he'd said. "Cave I use in emergencies. Can you walk if I help you?" She'd nodded, though in truth she wasn't sure. But something in his steady presence made her want to try. They'd moved through the storm together, his arm around her waist, half carrying her weight. She'd lost track of time. It might have been 10 minutes or an hour. All she'd known was his steady presence beside her, his voice occasionally telling her they were almost there, just a bit further. "Stay with me." The cave had appeared like a miracle, a dark mouth in the white mountainside. He'd guided her inside, out of the wind, and the relief of that alone had nearly made her weep. The interior was small but dry, and to her amazement, there were supplies stacked against one wall. Firewood, blankets, some basic provisions. "I keep several spots like this," he'd explained, already building a fire with practiced hands. "Never know when you'll need them." Within minutes, he'd had a fire crackling, its warmth spreading through the small space. He'd wrapped her in blankets, examined her hands and feet with gentle efficiency, his face grave but not alarmed. "You'll keep your fingers," he'd said. "Toes, too, probably." But it was close. She'd finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Thank you." He'd nodded, feeding more wood to the fire. "Jacob Stern." Sarah Cole. That had been the extent of their conversation that first hour. He'd tended to the practical matters of survival, melting snow for water, preparing a simple meal, making sure the fire stayed strong. She'd watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the way he seemed completely at home in this harsh place. He was probably 40, maybe a few years older, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of weather and solitude. His hands were scarred, capable. Everything about him spoke of competence, of a man who'd learned to rely on himself alone. As the feeling returned to her extremities, pain came with it, the burning sensation of frozen flesh warming. She'd bit her lip to keep from crying out, but he'd noticed anyway. "I know it hurts," he'd said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Means you're coming back. That's good. How long?" She'd started, then had to pause to gather strength. "How long until I can travel?" He'd looked at her, then at the cave entrance where the storm raged unabated. "Storm like this? 2, maybe 3 days before it's safe to move. That's if it doesn't get worse." 3 days. Alone in a cave with a strange man. Sarah's upbringing screamed that this was improper, dangerous, a dozen other things a respectable widow shouldn't do. But the alternative was death, and she'd already come too close to that for propriety to matter much. Besides, there was something in Jacob Stern's demeanor that eased her fear. He kept a respectful distance, averted his eyes when she adjusted her blankets, spoke only when necessary. He wasn't looking at her the way some men did, with calculation or hunger. He looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, a responsibility he'd accepted without enthusiasm, but wouldn't shirk. As the hours passed and exhaustion finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought was that she'd taken the hand of a stranger in a blizzard, and against all reason, she was still alive. Sarah woke to the sound of wind howling outside the cave and the crackle of fire nearby. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. The storm, the collapse, the stranger who'd saved her life. She opened her eyes to find Jacob sitting near the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that caught the firelight. He noticed her stirring. "How do you feel?" She took inventory of her body. Everything ached, and her fingers and toes still burned with residual pain, but she was alive and warm. "Better," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. He nodded, setting aside his work. "You should eat something. Keep your strength up." He'd prepared a simple breakfast, some kind of jerky and hardtack softened in hot water. It wasn't much, but Sarah ate gratefully, realizing she couldn't remember her last proper meal. As she ate, she studied him more carefully in the morning light. His face was lined but not unkind, his movements economical and purposeful. He wore his solitude like a second coat. "The storm?" she asked between bites. "Still going. Might be another day, maybe 2. He poured her some of the heated water. "We've got enough supplies if we're careful." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. She noticed something then, a glint of metal at her finger. Her wedding ring, the simple gold band Thomas had placed there 9 years ago. She turned it absently, a habit she'd developed since his death. "You're married," Jacob observed, though it wasn't quite a question. "Was," Sarah corrected softly. "Widowed. 3 months now." He didn't offer the usual condolences people gave, the meaningless words about time healing and God's plan. He simply nodded, as if he understood that some losses didn't need commentary. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken things. Sarah found herself wanting to fill it, to explain why a widow was alone on a mountain trail in December. "I was running," she said finally, "from Kansas, from the farm Thomas and I built together, from the life we had." She stared into her cup. "I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every room, every piece of furniture, it all reminded me of what I'd lost. So I sold everything and left." "Where were you heading?" "I don't know. West, anywhere that wasn't there." She looked up at him. "That probably sounds foolish." "No," Jacob said quietly. "It sounds human." Something in his tone made her think he knew about running, about leaving things behind. But before she could ask, he stood and moved to check their supplies. As the day wore on, Sarah became more aware of their situation. The cave was perhaps 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand in most places. Jacob had clearly used it before. The firewood was neatly stacked, and there was a careful arrangement of supplies that spoke of someone who planned for emergencies. She noticed he had a pack near his sleeping area, and when he opened it to retrieve more food, she caught a glimpse of something that didn't fit with the rest of his survival gear. It was a small wooden toy horse, carved with remarkable detail. The craftsmanship was beautiful. You could see the individual muscles in the horse's legs, the careful curve of its neck. It was clearly made with love, meant for a child's hands. Jacob noticed her looking and quickly closed the pack. His expression shuttered, became unreadable. "That's beautiful work," Sarah said carefully. "Old project," he replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. But Sarah had seen something in his face in that brief moment, pain, raw and deep. Whatever the story behind that toy horse, it was connected to why Jacob Stern lived alone in these mountains. She didn't press. She understood about wounds too tender to touch. The afternoon passed slowly. The storm outside intensified, if anything, and Sarah found herself grateful for Jacob's foresight in maintaining these emergency shelters. Without him, she would have died out there. The thought sobered her. She'd been so focused on escaping her grief that she'd nearly thrown away the life Thomas had wanted her to have. "I was careless," she said suddenly. "Coming up here this late in the season. Someone at the trading post warned me, but I didn't listen." Jacob looked at her from across the fire. "Most people who come to the mountains are running from something. The mountains don't care what you're running from. They just care if you're prepared." "Were you?" she asked. "Prepared when you came here?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he admitted, "but I learned." As evening approached, Sarah felt the need to be useful, to contribute something. She'd been raised to pull her own weight, and lying wrapped in blankets while Jacob did all the work didn't sit well with her. "Let me help with dinner," she offered. Jacob looked skeptical, but handed her some dried vegetables to prepare. Sarah set to work, but her hands were still clumsy from the frostbite, and she nearly knocked the pot into the fire twice. On the third near miss, Jacob gently took the vegetables from her. "Maybe rest one more day," he suggested, not unkindly. Sarah felt tears of frustration prick her eyes. She'd always been capable, competent. Now she couldn't even prepare a simple meal without making a mess of it. "Hey," Jacob said, his voice softer than she'd heard it. "You nearly died yesterday. Give yourself some grace." She looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. For just a moment, she saw past the weathered mountain man to someone who understood what it meant to feel helpless. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me. For this." He nodded and returned to preparing the meal. But Sarah caught something in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been loneliness. They ate in companionable silence as the wind howled outside. Sarah found herself studying Jacob when he wasn't looking. He had a ritual to everything he did. The way he checked the fire, the way he arranged the supplies, the way he periodically looked toward the cave entrance as if keeping watch. These were the habits of a man who'd survived alone for a long time, who trusted nothing but his own vigilance. After dinner, Sarah pulled out her leather journal from her pack. The sight of it surprised her. She'd forgotten she'd even packed it. The journal had been her constant companion for years, filled with her thoughts and small sketches, but she hadn't opened it since Thomas's death. What was there to record? Days that all felt the same, grief that never changed, a future that held nothing but emptiness. But now, sitting in a cave with a stranger while a blizzard raged outside, she felt the familiar pull of wanting to capture this moment. Her fingers, still stiff, fumbled with the pencil, but she managed to open to a blank page. Jacob noticed. "You write?" "Used to," Sarah said. "And sketch?" "I haven't in months, though." "Why'd you stop?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. After Thomas died, everything felt flat, like the color had gone out of the world. I couldn't see the point of recording days that all looked the same. Jacob nodded slowly, as if he understood. "What changed?" Sarah looked around the cave, at the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, at Jacob's weathered face in the flickering light, at the opening where snow blew in occasional gusts. "This," she said, "this is different. This feels real." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. He reached for his whittling, the piece of wood he'd been working on that morning. "Then you should write it down." So she did. Her hand was shaky at first, the letters uneven, but gradually the words came. She wrote about the storm, about the moment she'd thought she would die, about the hand that had reached for her through the snow. And then, because she couldn't help herself, she began to sketch. She drew Jacob as he sat across the fire, focused on his carving. She tried to capture the way the light caught the planes of his face, the concentration in his expression, the capable strength in his hands. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't notice him watching until she looked up. Their eyes met across the fire. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be caught studying him so intently. "May I see?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, then turned the journal toward him. Jacob leaned closer to look at the sketch. His expression was unreadable at first, then something softened in his eyes. "You've got a gift," he said quietly. "You captured something true." "What's that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Loneliness," he said finally. "You drew a lonely man." The honesty in his words took her breath away. She'd expected deflection or dismissal, not this raw admission. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that we're both lonely. We've just been lonely in different places." Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw past his careful walls to the person underneath. Someone who'd been alone so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "Yeah," he said softly, "maybe we are." That night, as they prepared for sleep, something had shifted between them. Jacob gave Sarah the warmer spot near the fire, without being asked. She watched as he settled on the far side of the cave, wrapping himself in a single blanket while she had two. "Jacob," she said into the darkness. "Yeah. Why do you live up here, alone?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Sarah thought he might not answer, might retreat back into his shell, but then his voice came through the darkness, rough with old pain. 5 years ago, I had a different life. Down in the valley, I worked as a carpenter, had a little house, thought I was building something that would last." He paused. "But things fell apart. I lost what mattered most. Came up here because I couldn't stand being around people anymore, couldn't stand the weight of their pity or their judgment." "What did you lose?" "Everything," he said simply. The single word carried the weight of stories untold, of grief so deep it had driven him into exile. Sarah understood. She'd almost done the same thing, fled so far into the wilderness that she'd nearly died. Maybe they were more alike than she'd realized. "I'm sorry," she said. "Me too," Jacob replied, "for whatever it is you lost that sent you running." In the darkness of the cave, with the storm raging outside and the fire burning low between them, two people who'd been running from their pasts found themselves, for the first time in a long time, not quite so alone. Sarah's last thought before sleep took her was of her wedding ring still on her finger. She'd worn it every day since Thomas's death, unable to imagine taking it off. But lying there in the cave, she found herself wondering if maybe, eventually, there might come a day when she could let go of what was and face what might be. The storm would pass. They would leave this cave. but something told her that whatever happened next, neither of them would be quite the same person who'd walked into this shelter. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell, but inside, warmed by fire and the first tentative threads of connection, Sarah Cole felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The cabin was more than Sarah had expected. From the outside, it looked like a simple mountain shelter, but inside she found a home. The main room was dominated by a stone fireplace that Jacob quickly stoked to life. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies, a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. Everything was neat, orderly, the home of someone who took pride in his space despite living alone. "There's a bedroom through that door," Jacob said, not quite meeting her eyes. "You can have it. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the look on his face stopped her. This wasn't up for discussion. He was already uncomfortable enough having a woman in his home. Pushing the boundaries of propriety further would only make things worse. "Thank you," she said instead, "for everything." He nodded and busied himself with preparing a meal, his movements efficient in the familiar space. Sarah watched him move around the kitchen, noting how different he seemed here. In the cave, he'd been a mountain man, all survival instinct and practical knowledge. Here, in his own home, she caught glimpses of who he'd been before, a carpenter, a husband, a father. Someone who'd built this place with his own hands and filled it with the careful touches of a man who understood what made a house a home. The dinner he prepared was simple but substantial. Venison stew with vegetables from his cold storage. Fresh bread he must have made before leaving on whatever journey had led him to find Sarah. They ate in comfortable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. After dinner, Jacob showed her around with an awkwardness that might have been endearing if she'd had the energy to appreciate it. The bedroom was small but comfortable, with a real bed and thick quilts. The window looked out over the mountains, offering a view that must be breathtaking in daylight. "There's a wash basin and pitcher," he said, pointing to the corner. "Water's cold, but there's soap. Tomorrow I can heat some water if you want a proper wash." "This is perfect," Sarah assured him. "Jacob, this is a beautiful home. You built all this yourself." "Most of it. Took the better part of 2 years." He looked around the room and she saw pride mixed with something sadder. "Thought maybe well, doesn't matter now." But Sarah understood what he'd left unsaid. He'd built this place thinking maybe someday he'd want to live again, not just exist. That maybe the time would come when the cabin could be more than a hermit's shelter. That night, lying in an actual bed for the first time in days, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to sort through her tangled feelings. She should be planning her next move. Where to go, what to do, how to start the new life she'd set out to build. But all she could think about was the man sleeping in the next room, the way he'd looked at her when she'd sketched him, the gentle understanding in his voice when they'd talked about grief. She was in dangerous territory. She knew that. Proper widows didn't develop feelings for mountain men they'd known for 3 days. Proper widows mourned for a decent interval, then perhaps remarried within their own community to someone suitable and safe. But Sarah was beginning to suspect she was tired of being proper. Morning brought bright sunshine and the kind of cold that made the inside of her nose freeze with each breath. She woke to the smell of coffee and found Jacob already up, working on some kind of repair to his door hinge. "Morning," he said, straightening up. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months." She accepted the cup of coffee he offered. "What needs fixing?" "Hinge was loose. Neglected it before I left." He went back to his work, and Sarah realized this was his way, finding small tasks to keep his hands busy when emotions ran too close to the surface. "How long were you gone before you found me?" "Just 3 days. Had some traps to check up in the high country." He set down his tools. "If I'd been a day later, But you weren't, Sarah said firmly. You found me exactly when you needed to. Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected rhythm. Jacob went about his daily work, checking traps, chopping firewood, maintaining his equipment. Sarah helped where she could, learning quickly that life in the mountains meant constant preparation, constant work. Nothing came easy, but there was satisfaction in the labor. She also explored the cabin more thoroughly and discovered things that told her about the man Jacob had been. Books on carpentry and forestry, but also poetry and philosophy. A half-finished rocking chair in the workshop that must have been meant for someone specific. And tucked away in a drawer, carefully wrapped in cloth, a tintype photograph. Sarah knew she shouldn't look, but she couldn't help herself. The photograph showed a younger Jacob, probably 15 years younger, standing beside a beautiful woman holding a little girl. Emma and Lucy, his lost family. They looked happy, the kind of happy that came from genuine love and contentment. The little girl was grinning, missing her front teeth, and Emma's hand rested on Jacob's arm with easy affection. I was 32 when that was taken. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the photograph. Jacob stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have. It's all right." He came closer, taking the photograph gently. "I keep it hidden because looking at it used to hurt too much. But lately," he studied the image. "Lately, I've been thinking maybe I hid too much away. Tried too hard to forget." "They were beautiful," Sarah said softly. "Your family. They were everything." Jacob's thumb traced over the image. "Lucy was 6 there. Loved horses. Loved anything with 4 legs, really. That's why I carved her that toy. She'd been asking for a pony, but we couldn't afford one, so I made her a wooden one instead." His voice cracked slightly. She carried it everywhere. Sarah's heart ached for him. What was Emma like? Patient, kind, stronger than she looked. He smiled faintly. "She saw something in me worth loving, though I never quite understood what. We were married 8 years, and every day I woke up grateful she'd chosen me." "I understand that," Sarah said. "That's how I felt about Thomas. Like I'd been given something precious that I didn't quite deserve." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared experience, shared loss, shared understanding of what it meant to love deeply and lose completely. "How long are you planning to stay?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had been avoiding thinking about it, avoiding the reality that she couldn't remain here indefinitely. But now, forced to confront it, she found she had no clear answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't have anywhere else to go, and winter travel seems deadly," he finished. "It is. Even for someone experienced, trying to cross the mountains now would be suicide." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "You could stay until spring. The thaw usually comes in late March, early April. That's when travel gets safer." "That's months away," Sarah said, her heart beating faster. "Jacob, I couldn't impose." "You wouldn't be imposing. You'd be—" He stopped, looking frustrated with himself. This cabin gets lonely in winter. Having someone here, someone to talk to, it would be nice. And you need somewhere safe to wait out the season. What would people say? A widow living alone with a man? There's nobody up here to say anything. Closest neighbor is 10 miles away and minds his own business. He met her eyes. "But if you're worried about propriety, I understand. We can figure something else out." Sarah thought about it. She thought about returning to the world below, about facing well-meaning people who would ask questions she didn't want to answer. She thought about the empty future she'd been running toward, undefined and frightening in its uncertainty. And then she thought about the past few days, about the conversations by firelight, about Jacob's patient teaching and unexpected understanding. She thought about the peace she'd found here, the first real peace since Thomas had died. "I'll stay," she said. until spring. But on one condition. What's that? I earn my keep. I won't be a burden or a guest. I work for my place here. Something like relief washed over Jacob's face. Deal. Though I warn you, I'm a demanding taskmaster. Sarah smiled. I think I can handle it. They shook hands formally, sealing their arrangement. But as their hands clasped, both of them felt it. The spark of something that was more than gratitude, more than convenience, something that scared them both because it felt too soon, too unexpected, too much like hope. Over the following week, Sarah learned the rhythms of mountain life. She learned to manage the wood stove, to melt snow for water, to preserve food in the cold storage Jacob had built into the hillside behind the cabin. She learned which of his traps to check and how to reset them, though she couldn't bring herself to actually kill anything yet. Jacob was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to show her something twice or 3 times until she got it right. And slowly, as they worked together, the awkwardness faded. They became partners in survival, each playing their role in the daily tasks that kept them fed and warm. Evenings became Sarah's favorite time. After dinner, Jacob would work on his carvings while Sarah wrote in her journal or sketched. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories from their past lives. Other times they simply existed in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd learned that you didn't always need words to feel connected. One evening, about 2 weeks after Sarah's arrival, she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. Jacob, you said you've been up here 5 years. Have you ever thought about going back? About rejoining the world? He was quiet for a long time, his knife moving steadily over the piece of wood in his hands. Sometimes, he finally admitted. Especially the first couple years. I'd think about going back down, trying to rebuild some kind of life. But every time I got close to actually doing it, I'd remember why I left. The pity in people's eyes. The way they'd talk about Emma and Lucy like they were trying to help, but really just making it worse. The emptiness of that house without them. So you stayed. So I stayed. Told myself I was better off alone, that I didn't need people. He looked up at her. But I think maybe I was wrong about that. Or maybe I just needed time. 5 years to learn how to be alone so I could remember how to be with someone again. The weight of his words settled over them both. Sarah knew he wasn't just talking about companionship in general. He was talking about them, about whatever was growing between them in this isolated cabin. I'm not ready, Sarah said softly. To be anything more than what we are now. It's too soon after Thomas, and I'm still trying to figure out who I am without him. I know, Jacob said. I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. I'm glad you're here, that's all. But they both knew it wasn't quite that simple. They both felt the pull, the growing awareness of each other that went beyond practical partnership. They both lay awake at night, separated by a single wall, wondering what it would mean if they allowed themselves to feel something more. For now, though, they maintained their careful distance. They worked together, ate together, talked together, but always with that invisible line between them, the one that marked the difference between companionship and something deeper. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Outside, winter deepened its hold on the mountains. Inside the cabin, 2 people who'd lost everything learned to build something new. Not a replacement for what they'd had, but something uniquely their own. A friendship forged in survival, seasoned with understanding, and tempered by the shared knowledge of loss. And if sometimes, in unguarded moments, their eyes held longer than necessary, or their hands brushed in passing, and neither pulled away immediately, well, that was between them and the mountains that kept their secrets. The discovery came on a quiet morning when Sarah was organizing the small bookshelf beside the fireplace. She'd been living in the cabin for 3 weeks now, and the space had begun to feel familiar, almost like home. She was dusting the books when a worn Bible slipped from the shelf and fell open on the floor. A photograph fluttered out, landing face up on the wooden planks. Sarah picked it up, intending to simply tuck it back in the Bible, but the image stopped her cold. It was a formal portrait, the kind families had taken in town studios. Jacob stood tall and proud, his arm around a beautiful dark-haired woman, Emma. And in front of them, grinning with pure childhood joy, was a little girl in a white dress. Lucy. The photograph was more detailed than the tintype she'd seen before. She could see Emma's gentle eyes, the laugh lines around Jacob's mouth that were gone now, replaced by the weathered grooves of someone who'd forgotten how to smile. And Lucy, she could see so much of Jacob in that little face, the same determined chin, the same direct gaze. Sarah's hands trembled as she held it. This wasn't just a photograph. This was everything Jacob had lost, everything that had driven him into these mountains to live alone for 5 years. This was the weight he carried every day, hidden behind his steady demeanor and practical ways. She heard the door open and quickly tried to put the photograph back, but it was too late. Jacob stood in the doorway, snowshoes in hand, his eyes fixed on the image in her hands. "I'm sorry," Sarah said immediately. "The Bible fell and this came out. I wasn't snooping, I promise." Jacob set down the snowshoes and crossed the room slowly. He took the photograph from her, his face unreadable. For a long moment he just stared at it, his thumb tracing the edge. "I don't keep this one hidden," he said quietly. "It's in the Bible because that's where Emma always kept our important things. Family records, letters from her mother, memories we wanted to preserve." He looked up at Sarah. "I just don't look at it very often anymore." "Why not?" "Because for a long time it hurt too much. Seeing what I'd lost, what I'd never get back. It was like losing them all over again every time I looked." He moved to sit by the fire, still holding the photograph. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe I got it wrong. Maybe by hiding from the memories, I was letting them fade. And they deserve better than that." Sarah sat down across from him, giving him space but staying close enough to offer comfort if he needed it. "Tell me about them," she said gently. "Really tell me. Not just the facts, but who they were." Jacob was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "Emma was a seamstress when I met her, best in the valley. She could look at a person once and know exactly what would suit them, how to make something both practical and beautiful. She made Lucy's dress in this picture, spent weeks on it, getting every detail perfect." His voice was thick with memory. She was quiet, but not shy, just thoughtful. She'd listen to a conversation for an hour before saying one thing, but that one thing would be exactly what everyone needed to hear. "She sounds wonderful." She was. And patient, Lord, she was patient. I was rough around the edges when we met, still learning my trade, not always good with words, but she saw something in me worth the effort. He smiled faintly. "Used to say I was like a piece of raw wood, needed careful shaping to show the grain, but worth the work." "And Lucy?" The smile on Jacob's face grew, tinged with both joy and sorrow. "Lucy was pure sunshine. From the moment she could walk, she was into everything, curious about the world, fearless, always asking questions. She'd follow me around the workshop, wanting to know how everything worked, why wood smelled different when you cut it, where the trees came from." He shook his head. "Drove me crazy sometimes, but I loved every minute of it." "She loved you very much. You can see it in the photograph. We had 6 years with her. 6 years of watching her grow, teaching her things, dreaming about who she'd become." Jacob's voice cracked. "And then the fever came through. Took half the children in the valley that winter. Emma got sick first, trying to care for Lucy. By the time I realized how serious it was too late for either of them." Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Oh, Jacob, I sat with them both, helpless, watching them slip away and knowing there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. He set the photograph on the table between them. Lucy went first. Emma held on another day, but I think part of her went with Lucy. She didn't want to leave me, but she couldn't bear being here without our daughter. That's not your fault. My head knows that. My heart still argues. He looked at Sarah, his eyes bright with unshed tears. After they died, I couldn't stay in that house. Couldn't walk past Lucy's room or sleep in the bed I'd shared with Emma. Couldn't face the neighbors who meant well but whose sympathy felt like salt in a wound. So I ran. Came up here and told myself I was starting over. But really, I was just hiding. You were surviving, Sarah corrected gently. Sometimes hiding is how we survive until we're strong enough to face things. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact beyond helping her over rough terrain, and the gesture felt intimate, vulnerable. Thank you, he said, for listening, for not judging, for understanding. Sarah squeezed his hand. I understand more than you know. After Thomas died, I did the same thing. Maybe I didn't come to the mountains, but I hid just as surely. I stopped writing, stopped seeing friends, stopped living any kind of life that might remind me of what I'd lost. And now I'm here, in a cabin in the mountains with a man who saved my life and somehow understands my grief better than anyone back home ever did. She smiled through her tears. I think maybe we're both learning to stop hiding. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped across the table, the photograph between them. Outside, the winter day faded toward evening, the mountains turning purple in the gathering dusk. Inside, two people who'd carried their grief alone began to understand that maybe, just maybe, sharing the weight made it bearable. That night, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to feel less like protection and more like denial. They still slept in separate rooms, still maintained the forms of propriety, but the invisible wall between them had developed cracks. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Jacob in the next room. Thinking about Emma and Lucy, about Thomas, about the loves they'd lost and the futures that had died with them. But she also thought about the hand that had reached for her in the blizzard, about the man who'd shared his shelter and his grief, about the possibility that maybe loss didn't have to be the end of the story. In the other room, Jacob held the photograph he'd looked at for the first time in months. He traced Emma's face, Lucy's smile, remembering the love he'd shared with them. And then he thought about Sarah, her courage, her kindness, her understanding. He thought about how the cabin felt different with her in it, how he'd started looking forward to evenings by the fire, how her laughter had brought sound back to a space that had been silent too long. He wasn't ready to let go of Emma and Lucy. He'd never be ready for that, and he didn't have to be. But maybe, just maybe, he could honor their memory while also allowing himself to live again. To feel again, to open his heart to the possibility that love could exist more than once in a lifetime. The mountains stood eternal around the cabin, holding their secrets, witnessing the slow thaw happening inside. Not the thaw of ice and snow. That would come with spring. This was a different kind of thaw, the kind that happened in hearts that had been frozen too long. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, both Sarah and Jacob wondered the same thing. What would it mean to take a chance on hope again? And more frighteningly, what would it mean if they didn't? The morning started like any other. Sarah was preparing breakfast while Jacob split firewood outside. The rhythmic crack of the axe, a familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to her mountain life. 6 weeks had passed since the blizzard, and they'd settled into a comfortable partnership that felt both natural and tentative, like something fragile they were both afraid to examine too closely. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. The whinny of a horse, distant but clear in the cold mountain air. Sarah moved to the window and saw Jacob standing motionless, axe forgotten in his hands, staring toward the tree line. A rider emerged from the forest, moving slowly through the deep snow. As he got closer, Sarah could make out more details: a heavy coat, a hat pulled low, and something that glinted on his chest. A badge. Jacob's entire body language changed. The relaxed posture she'd grown accustomed to disappeared, replaced by a coiled tension that reminded her of a wolf sensing danger. He set down the axe carefully and moved toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the approaching rider. "Sarah," he said as he entered, his voice tight. "I need you to go into the bedroom and stay there. Don't come out until I tell you." "What's wrong? Who is that?" "Please, just trust me." There was urgency in his voice, almost fear, and it frightened her more than anything else could have. Sarah retreated to the bedroom but left the door cracked open enough to hear. She heard the cabin door open, heard Jacob's voice, carefully neutral. "Marshall." "Jacob Stern." The stranger's voice was gravelly, tired. "Been a long time." "Not long enough, Wells." There was the sound of boots on the wooden floor, the creak of a chair. Sarah's heart pounded. A marshal. Jacob was wanted by a marshal. The implications crashed over her like a wave. "Mind if I sit? Been riding since dawn, and I'm not as young as I used to be." "Help yourself." Jacob's tone was wary. "Though I'm surprised you found this place. Took me 8 months. You picked a good spot to disappear. I'll give you that." A pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Jacob. But we need to talk. About what happened in Denver." "About what happened in Denver," Marshal Wells confirmed. "You know there's still a warrant out for you, murder charge. That hasn't gone away." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Murder. Jacob was wanted for murder. She thought about the gentleman who'd saved her life, who carved beautiful toys, who spoke about his lost family with such tenderness. It couldn't be true. It couldn't. "I didn't murder anyone." Jacob's voice was hard. "I killed a man. There's a difference. So tell me what happened. Your side. Because the way the law sees it, you shot Clayton Mercer in a saloon without provocation and then fled before trial. That's not what happened. Then what did happen?" Sarah heard Jacob take a deep breath. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully, as if each one cost him something. "I was in Denver, picking up supplies. Stopped at a saloon for a drink before heading back. There was a woman there, Mary Catherine Ross, one of the saloon girls, and there was a man harassing her. Clayton Mercer. He was drunk, getting aggressive. She kept trying to get away from him, but he wouldn't let her go. And you intervened. I asked him to leave her alone, told him to walk away." Jacob's voice grew rougher. "He took a swing at me. I blocked it. Then he went for her, grabbed her by the throat, started choking her. She was turning blue, and everyone else in that saloon just watched. So you shot him. So I stopped him. He had 6 inches and 50 pounds on me, and he was in a rage. I drew my gun, told him to let her go. He didn't. He squeezed harder, looking right at me while he did it." A pause. "So yes, Marshal. I shot him. Center mass. He went down, and Mary Catherine could breathe again. Self-defense. Defense of another. That's what I tried to tell them. But Clayton Mercer's father is Richard Mercer. Richest man in Denver, owns half the businesses there, has judges and politicians in his pocket. He wanted someone to pay for his son's death, and I was convenient. So you ran. So I chose living over a rigged trial and a certain hanging. You would have done the same." The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, trying to process everything she'd heard. Jacob had killed a man, but to save a woman's life. He'd run not out of guilt, but out of survival. And now, after 5 years, the law had finally found him. "Thing is, Jacob," Marshal Wells said finally, "I've been doing some digging. talked to people who were there that night, got different stories than what the official record says. What kind of stories? Stories about how Clayton Mercer had a history of violence against women, how he'd put 2 other saloon girls in the hospital before that night, how witnesses saw him attack that woman, saw you try to talk him down before drawing your weapon. Another pause. Stories about how some of those witnesses changed their testimony after Richard Mercer paid them a visit. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. The marshal believed him, or at least doubted the official version. "Why are you telling me this?" Jacob asked. "Because I've been a lawman for 23 years, and I know the difference between a murderer and a man who did what he had to do. But here's the problem, Jacob. The warrant still exists. The law still wants you, and as much as my gut tells me you're innocent, I swore an oath. So you're taking me in. I'm giving you a choice." The marshal's voice was grave. "You can run again, deeper into the mountains or farther west. I'll give you a day's head start. Tell them I came up empty. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, but you'll be free. Or you come back to Denver with me. Face trial. Let me testify on your behalf. I've been talking to a young lawyer there, a man named Bennett, who takes on cases like yours. He thinks with the right evidence, the right witnesses, he can get the charges dropped. And if he can't, then you hang." The marshal didn't soften it. "That's the risk. But Jacob, I've seen your face on wanted posters in every town between here and Denver. Eventually, someone else will find you, someone who won't care about the truth, who'll just want the reward money. At least this way, you'd have a fighting chance at clearing your name." Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She pushed open the bedroom door and stepped out. Both men turned to look at her, the marshal's eyes widening in surprise. "Who's this?" Wells asked. "A friend," Jacob said quickly. "She's got nothing to do with this." "Sarah Cole," she said, moving to stand beside Jacob. "And he saved my life. I was dying in a blizzard, and he risked his own safety to help me. Does that sound like a murderer to you, Marshal?" Wells studied her, taking in her determined expression, the way she'd positioned herself slightly in front of Jacob as if she could protect him. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "No, ma'am, it doesn't. Which is why I'm giving him this choice." He looked back at Jacob. "You've got until dawn tomorrow to decide. I'll camp down by the creek. When the sun comes up, either you ride out with me or I ride out alone and tell them I lost your trail." "Why are you doing this?" Jacob asked. "Giving me a choice. Risking your career. Because 20 years ago, I shot a man who was beating his wife. Self-defense, clear as day. But the man had connections, and suddenly it wasn't so clear. If I hadn't had people willing to stand up for me, tell the truth, I'd have been the one on trial." Wells stood, moving toward the door. "Everyone deserves that chance, Jacob. Everyone deserves people willing to fight for them." After the marshal left, Sarah and Jacob stood in silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, Jacob turned to her. "You should have stayed in the bedroom. And let you face this alone? Not a chance." She took his hand. "Jacob, what he said about going back is suicide. Even with a good lawyer, even with the marshal's testimony, Richard Mercer owns that town. He'll make sure I hang. But if you run, you'll never be free. You'll spend the rest of your life hiding, always afraid of being discovered." She squeezed his hand. "There has to be another way." "There isn't." "Yes, there is." Sarah's mind was racing. "You said there were witnesses who saw what really happened. What if we could find them, get them to tell the truth?" "They already changed their stories once." "Why would they change them back?" "Because I can help." Sarah moved to face him directly. "Jacob, I'm educated. I know how to write, how to argue a point, how to make people see reason. And I'm a widow, which gives me respectability. If I were there, if I stood beside you, testified on your behalf, wrote letters to newspapers, rallied public support, it might make a difference. Sarah, you can't throw your life away for me. I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing to fight for someone who deserves justice. Someone who saved my life, who gave me shelter, who helped me remember how to be human again. Her voice broke. I can't lose you, Jacob. Not now, not when I've just found... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but they both knew what she'd almost said. Not when I've just found something worth living for. Jacob pulled her close, holding her tight. You know what you're asking. If we do this, if we go back to Denver together, there's no guarantee it'll work, and if it doesn't, then at least we tried. Together. She pulled back to look at him. Take my hand, Jacob. Trust me, just like you asked me to in that blizzard. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes, the courage that had brought her through the mountains and into his life, and he realized that somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, they'd become something more than two lonely people sharing a cabin. They'd become partners, maybe more than partners. All right, he said finally. We'll go to Denver, together. We'll face this head-on and see what happens. Together, Sarah confirmed, and in that moment they both understood they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. Whatever happened in Denver, whatever the future held, they were in it together now. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Inside the cabin, two people who'd been running from their pasts made the decision to turn and face their futures, no matter the cost. Marshall Wells would get his answer at dawn. But the more important answer, the one about what it meant to take a chance on hope, on justice, on the possibility of love, that answer was already beginning to form in the space between two hearts that had been broken and were slowly learning to beat again. The night before they left for Denver was the longest of Sarah's life. She and Jacob sat by the fire, neither of them able to sleep, both acutely aware that by morning they would be setting in motion events that could end in Jacob's death. I need you to understand something, Jacob said quietly, breaking the silence. If this goes wrong, if the trial doesn't go our way, I don't want you blaming yourself. This is my choice, and I'm making it with my eyes open. Don't talk like that, Sarah replied, but her voice shook. We're going to find a way. We have to. Jacob reached over and took her hand, and this time neither of them pretended it was just for comfort or warmth. This time they both acknowledged what the touch meant. Sarah, there's something I need to say, in case I don't get another chance. He looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes holding all the things he'd been too afraid to voice. These past weeks with you, they've reminded me what it feels like to be alive, not just surviving, but actually living. And I need you to know that whatever happens in Denver, you gave me that gift. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Jacob, let me finish. He squeezed her hand. I loved Emma. I'll always love her. And Lucy, she was my whole world. But they're gone. And I think they'd want me to keep living, to find happiness again if I could. And with you, I thought maybe I could. Maybe I already was. You are, Sarah said fiercely. And you're going to keep living because we're going to win this. We're going to prove your innocence and you're going to have a future. If I do, I want it to be with you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. I know it's too soon. I know we're both still carrying our grief, but Sarah, I'm falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that before we walk into whatever's waiting in Denver. Sarah couldn't speak. Her heart was too full, her emotions too tangled. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him, gently at first, then with all the fear and hope and desperate longing she'd been holding back for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying. I love you too, she whispered. God help me, I do, and that's why we're going to fight like hell to make sure you survive this. They spent the rest of the night planning. Jacob retrieved a small metal box from a hidden compartment in the floor, his emergency cache of money and important documents. Sarah wrote out everything she could remember about the night in the cave, about Jacob's character, about the man he'd shown himself to be. They discussed strategies, potential witnesses, arguments that might sway a jury. As dawn approached, Jacob went to his workshop and returned with something wrapped in soft cloth. He unwound it carefully to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "This was Emma's," he said softly. "Her mother gave it to her when we married. Inside are photographs. One of me, one of Lucy. She wore it every day until—" He stopped, steadying himself. "I want you to have it." "Jacob, I can't. This is too precious." "That's exactly why I'm giving it to you. You need to understand what you mean to me, what you've come to mean. Emma would have liked you, Sarah. She would have wanted someone like you in my life if she couldn't be here." He fastened the locket around Sarah's neck. "Wear it as a reminder of love that was and love that can be." Sarah touched the locket, feeling its weight against her chest. It was trust and hope and a promise all at once. A symbol of Jacob's past and their possible future, connected through the thin silver chain. When Marshal Wells arrived at first light, he found them waiting outside the cabin, 2 horses saddled and ready. If he was surprised to see Sarah prepared to travel, he didn't show it. "So you're both coming," he observed. "We are," Jacob confirmed. "And Marshal, Sarah's not part of this. She's a witness to my character, nothing more. Whatever happens, she stays free and clear." "Understood." Wells studied them both, seeing something in their joined hands, in the way they stood close together. "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Takes courage to face your past instead of running from it." The journey to Denver took 3 days. They traveled slowly, carefully, stopping each night to rest and plan. Marshal Wells proved to be a valuable ally. He shared what he'd learned from his investigation, named potential witnesses who might testify, warned them about the challenges they'd face. "Richard Mercer still owns half the town," Wells explained one evening. "He's got money, influence, and a hatred for the man who killed his son that's burned hot for 5 years. He's not going to make this easy." "What about the woman Jacob saved?" Sarah asked. "Mary Catherine Ross. Where is she now?" "Still in Denver, working at a different saloon. I talked to her briefly. She's scared, doesn't want to testify. Says Mercer threatened her after Jacob fled. Told her if she ever spoke about what really happened, she'd regret it." "Then we need to convince her," Sarah said firmly. "We need to show her that speaking the truth is worth the risk." Wells looked at her with something like respect. "You've got fire in you, Mrs. Cole. Jacob's lucky to have you fighting for him." "He'd do the same for me," Sarah replied, and Jacob squeezed her hand in silent agreement. As they got closer to Denver, Jacob grew quieter, more withdrawn. Sarah understood. He was preparing himself for what might come, steeling himself for the possibility of failure. She wanted to comfort him, but didn't know how. How do you comfort someone facing their own potential execution? On the final night before reaching Denver, they camped in a small clearing. Marshal Wells, perhaps sensing they needed privacy, made his bed some distance away. Sarah and Jacob sat by their fire, watching the flames dance against the darkness. "Tell me about Kansas," Jacob said suddenly. "About your life with Thomas. The good parts." Sarah was surprised by the request, but she understood what he was really asking. "Tell me something beautiful to hold on to, just in case." "We had this oak tree in the front yard," she began. "Thomas's grandfather planted it when he first claimed the land. In spring, it would bloom with these tiny white flowers that smelled like honey. Thomas and I used to sit under it in the evenings, watching the sunset, planning our future. We'd talk about the children we'd have, the life we'd build, all the dreams we thought we had time to fulfill." "Did you love him very much?" "I did. He was kind and steady, and he made me laugh. We weren't perfect, no marriages, but we were happy. And when he died, I thought that was it, that I'd had my one chance at love and lost it forever. And now? Sarah looked at Jacob, at the man who'd found her dying in a blizzard and given her not just her life back, but a reason to live it. Now I know that love doesn't work that way, that the heart has room for more than one chapter, more than one story. I'll always love Thomas, always carry him with me. But I can love you too, Jacob. And that doesn't diminish what I had with him. It honors it, because he'd want me to be happy. Jacob pulled her close, and they sat like that for a long time, holding each other against the cold and the fear and the uncertain future. When they finally kissed, it was with the desperate intensity of people who knew tomorrow might take everything away. "Promise me something," Sarah whispered against his lips. "Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens in Denver, we don't give up. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with." "I promise," Jacob said. "As long as you're beside me, I'll fight." They arrived in Denver the next afternoon. The city was bigger than Sarah had expected, bustling with activity despite the winter cold. People stared as they rode through the streets, Marshal Wells in his official capacity, Jacob in shackles that the marshal had apologetically insisted upon, and Sarah riding beside them with her chin held high, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. They went first to the jailhouse, where Jacob would be held until the hearing. As they locked him in a cell, Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. This was real now. Jacob was a prisoner, his life in the hands of a justice system that had already proven itself corrupt. "I'll find us a room at a boarding house," Wells told Sarah. "Somewhere respectable, for a widow. And tomorrow I'll introduce you to Bennett, the lawyer I mentioned. He's young but smart, and he genuinely cares about justice." Sarah barely heard him. All she could see was Jacob behind those bars, already looking smaller somehow, diminished by captivity. "Sarah," Jacob called softly, "look at me." She met his eyes, trying not to cry. "We're going to be all right," he said, though they both knew he couldn't promise that. "Go with the marshal. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start fighting." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. As Marshal Wells led her away, she touched the locket at her throat. Emma's locket, now hers. A reminder of what they were fighting for. The boarding house Wells found was clean and respectable, run by a kindly older woman who asked no questions about why a widow was traveling with a marshal. Sarah lay awake that first night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Jacob in that cell, about the hearing that would determine his fate, about the wealthy man who wanted him dead. She pulled out her journal and began to write. Not about her feelings, though those threatened to overwhelm her. Instead, she wrote what she would say in court. She wrote arguments and appeals to reason. She wrote about the man Jacob was, not the crime he'd been accused of. She wrote until her hand cramped and dawnlight crept through the window, and then she prepared to fight the battle that would determine whether love, new, unexpected, hard-won love, would have a chance to grow, or whether it would be cut down before it could truly bloom. In his cell, Jacob watched the same dawn break and thought about the woman who'd agreed to risk everything for him. He thought about Emma and Lucy, about the life he'd lost. And he thought about Sarah, about the life he might still have if courage and truth proved stronger than money and corruption. The battle was about to begin. And for the first time in 5 years, Jacob Stern had something more than survival to fight for. He had hope, and he had love. And sometimes, in the end, that's all you need to face the darkness. The courtroom was packed when Sarah arrived the next morning. Word had spread about the hearing, partly due to her letters, partly due to the natural curiosity people had about a 5-year-old case suddenly resurfacing. She saw Richard Mercer sitting in the front row, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit, his face set in hard lines of barely controlled anger. This was the man who'd bought false testimony, who'd driven Jacob into exile, who wanted nothing more than to see him hang. Sarah took her seat behind Bennett's table, close enough to see Jacob when they brought him in. When he entered in shackles, their eyes met, and she saw both fear and determination there. She touched the locket at her throat, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The judge, an older man named Harrison with a reputation for fairness, called the hearing to order. The prosecution went first, laying out their case exactly as they had 5 years ago. Clayton Mercer, upstanding citizen, shot without provocation by Jacob Stern in a Denver saloon. Witnesses testified to the shooting, their statements carefully rehearsed to paint Jacob as a dangerous man prone to violence. Sarah watched it all with growing frustration. Every word was technically true. Jacob had shot Clayton, but the context, the truth of what led to that moment, was completely absent. Then it was Bennett's turn. He started with Marshal Wells, who testified about his investigation, about the inconsistencies he'd found, about Jacob's reputation as a good man who'd lived peacefully in the mountains for 5 years. The marshal's badge carried weight, and Sarah saw several jurors lean forward with interest. Then came the bartender, Thomas Murphy, who'd worked at the saloon that night. His hands shook as he took the stand, but his voice was steady. "I saw everything," Murphy testified. Clayton Mercer was drunk, had been for hours. He'd been bothering Mary Catherine Ross all evening, getting more aggressive each time she tried to get away. When Mr. Stern intervened, Mercer attacked him first, then went for Mary Catherine's throat. He was choking her. She couldn't breathe. Everyone could see she was in real danger, but nobody moved, except Mr. Stern. "And what did Mr. Stern do?" Bennett asked. He drew his gun, told Mercer to let her go. Mercer just squeezed harder, like he wanted to prove he could kill her right there in front of everyone. So Mr. Stern fired. 1 shot, and Mercer went down. That woman lived because of what Mr. Stern did. "Mr. Murphy, why didn't you testify to this 5 years ago?" Murphy's face reddened with shame. "Because Richard Mercer came to see me. Offered me money first to change my story. When I refused, he threatened my family. Said accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. I got scared. I lied. And I've regretted it every day since." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order. Sarah saw Richard Mercer's face darken with rage, but he remained silent. Bennett called Sarah next. She walked to the stand with her head high, determined to make every word count. She testified to Jacob's character, to how he'd saved her life, to the man she'd come to know over months in the mountains. She spoke of his grief for his lost family, his isolation, his fundamental decency. "Mrs. Cole," Bennett said, "you've spent considerable time with the defendant. Based on your observations, do you believe him capable of unprovoked murder?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Absolutely not. Jacob Stern is one of the most principled men I've ever known. He values life, honors the memory of those he's lost. If he killed Clayton Mercer, it was because he had no other choice, because someone's life depended on it." The prosecution tried to discredit her, suggesting she was romantically involved with Jacob and therefore biased. Sarah didn't deny it. "Yes," she said simply, "I love him, and that love has given me insight into his character that others might not have. But my testimony isn't based on emotion. It's based on months of observing how he acts, how he treats others, how he lives his life, and everything I've seen tells me he's innocent of murder." As Sarah returned to her seat, she saw something she hadn't expected. A woman standing at the back of the courtroom, clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders. Mary Catherine Ross. She'd come after all. Bennett saw her too. "Your Honor, I'd like to call one more witness. Mary Catherine Ross." The courtroom fell silent as Mary Catherine made her way to the stand. She looked terrified, her eyes darting to Richard Mercer, but she kept walking. When she took the oath, her voice shook but held. "Miss Ross," Bennett said gently, You were present at the saloon the night Clayton Mercer died. Can you tell us what happened?" Mary Catherine took a deep breath. Then she began to speak. She described Clayton Mercer's escalating aggression, how he'd grabbed her, how she'd tried to get away. She described the moment his hands closed around her throat, the terror of not being able to breathe, the certainty that she was going to die. And she described Jacob Stern's intervention, how he'd tried to talk Mercer down first, how he'd only shot when it became clear Mercer wouldn't stop. "He saved my life," Mary Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "And I let them make him a villain because I was scared. I let them twist the truth and drive him away, and I've hated myself for it every day since. But I'm not scared anymore. Or maybe I am, but I'm more scared of letting an innocent man hang for something that was self-defense. That was justice, not murder." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison had to call for order 3 times before people settled down. Sarah saw Richard Mercer storm out, his face purple with rage, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out, spoken in the voice of the woman Jacob had saved. Bennett rested his case. The prosecution tried to recover, tried to discredit Mary Catherine and Murphy. But the damage was done. The truth had a power that money couldn't buy. Judge Harrison called for a recess to consider the evidence. As they led Jacob back to his cell, he caught Sarah's eye. She saw hope there now, real hope, and she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd done enough. The weight felt eternal. Sarah paced the hallway outside the courtroom, unable to sit still. Marshal Wells stood nearby, his expression cautiously optimistic. Bennett reviewed his notes, preparing for whatever came next. Finally, after 2 hours that felt like 2 years, they were called back in. Judge Harrison looked out over the courtroom, his expression grave. Then he began to speak, and with each word, Sarah felt the future taking shape around them. After careful consideration of the evidence presented today, Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "This court finds that the original warrant for Jacob Stern's arrest was issued under false pretenses. The testimony of multiple witnesses, including the victim herself, makes clear that Mr. Stern's actions on the night in question constituted justifiable defense of another person's life." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "evidence suggests that witness testimony in the original investigation was coerced through threats and bribery. This court cannot and will not uphold a warrant obtained through such corrupt means." He looked directly at Jacob. "Mr. Stern, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go, with the court's apology for the injustice you have suffered." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Sarah pushed through the crowd toward Jacob, who stood frozen, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. When she reached him, he caught her in his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "We did it," she whispered against his chest. "Jacob, you're free." "We did it," he corrected, pulling back to look at her. "You did it, Sarah. You fought for me when I'd given up hope. You believed in me." Around them, people congratulated them, shook Jacob's hand, thanked him for finally exposing the corruption that had tainted the original case. Marshal Wells smiled broadly, clearly satisfied with the outcome. Bennett looked exhausted but triumphant, and Mary Catherine Ross, who'd found the courage to speak truth to power, hugged Sarah with tears of relief. "Thank you," Mary Catherine said, "for giving me the strength to do what I should have done 5 years ago." "You saved his life," Sarah replied. "Your testimony made the difference." The next week passed in a blur of paperwork and arrangements. Jacob's record was officially cleared, his name restored. The newspapers that had once called him a murderer now praised his courage. Richard Mercer, facing his own investigation for witness tampering, retreated from public view. But more important than any of that was what happened in the quiet moments between the official proceedings. Jacob and Sarah, finally free from the shadow of the warrant, had to figure out what came next. They stayed in Denver for 2 weeks, partly to finalize the legal matters, partly to give themselves time to adjust to this new reality. They walked through the city together, no longer fugitive and advocate, but simply two people exploring a future that had seemed impossible just days before. One evening, as they sat in a small restaurant sharing dinner, Jacob reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "I've been thinking about what happens now," he said. "The cabin in the mountains. It's still there, still my home. But Sarah, I don't want to go back to being alone up there. I don't want that life anymore." "What do you want?" "I want you," he said simply. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you're there. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. The mountains, the valley, even staying here in Denver if that's what you want. I don't care where we are as long as we're together." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I want that too, more than anything." "Then marry me," Jacob said. "I know it's fast. I know people will talk, but I've already lost 5 years to fear and hiding. I don't want to lose another day pretending I don't love you with everything I have." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married a week later in a small church, with Marshall Wells and his sister as witnesses and Mary Catherine Ross in attendance. It was a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate wedding Sarah had had with Thomas, but it felt right. It felt like the beginning of something true and hard-won, built on understanding and forged in adversity. Sarah wore a simple dress and the locket Jacob had given her, Emma's locket, now a bridge between past and present, a symbol of love that honored what came before while embracing what could be. And when Jacob slipped a simple band onto her finger, she felt Thomas's ring on her other hand and knew that both loves could exist, both memories could be honored. They returned to the mountain cabin in early spring, just as the thaw was beginning. The journey that had nearly killed Sarah months before was easier now, with Jacob at her side and hope in her heart. When they crested that final ridge and saw the cabin waiting for them, Sarah understood that this was home now. Not because of the building itself, but because of the man beside her and the life they would build together. Jacob made good on his promise to expand the cabin. He built Sarah a proper studio with large windows facing the mountains, where she could write and sketch with good light. She filled it with journals and art supplies and slowly began to write again, not just for herself, but for publication. She wrote stories about the frontier, about survival and second chances, about the strength it took to keep living after loss. They planted a garden that first spring, working side by side to coax life from the mountain soil. Neighbors, few and far between, began to visit, and Sarah found herself part of a small community of hardy souls who'd chosen the mountains over easier lives. She and Jacob hosted gatherings occasionally, their cabin filled with conversation and laughter in a way it never had been when Jacob lived alone. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, as they had during those first tentative days in the cave. Sometimes Sarah sketched while Jacob carved. Sometimes they talked about their lost loves, keeping Emma and Lucy and Thomas alive through memory and story. And sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, that moving forward didn't require leaving the past behind. A year after their wedding, Sarah sold her first story to a Denver newspaper, a piece about surviving a blizzard and finding unexpected salvation. It was the beginning of a modest career that would bring her satisfaction and purpose. And though she never became famous, her words touched people who read them, offering hope to those who thought their stories were over. Jacob continued his work in the mountains, but now he had a reason beyond survival. He built furniture that he sold in the valley towns, beautiful pieces that showed his skill and artistry. And when he carved, he no longer made toys for a daughter who was gone. Instead, he made gifts for Sarah, for neighbors, for the future they were building together. They never forgot their first loves. Emma and Lucy lived in photographs on the mantel, in stories Jacob told on quiet nights, in the locket Sarah wore every day. Thomas lived in Sarah's journals, in memories she shared with Jacob, in the ring she still wore alongside her wedding band. These loves weren't competition or betrayal. They were foundation, the ground on which new love could grow. Sometimes, on winter evenings when snow fell soft and silent outside their windows, Sarah would remember that moment in the blizzard when Jacob had extended his hand and asked her to trust him. How close she'd come to refusing, to giving in to the cold and letting go of life entirely. And she'd feel overwhelmed with gratitude for the choice she'd made, to take that hand, to trust a stranger, to open herself to the possibility of hope when all seemed lost. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob would ask when he saw that distant look in her eyes. "About a hand reaching through snow," she'd reply. "About the choice that saved my life." And Jacob would pull her close, understanding what she meant, because he'd made the same choice. To reach out instead of staying isolated, to trust instead of protecting himself, to risk his heart again despite knowing how much it could hurt. They'd both lost so much: family, innocence, the futures they'd planned. But in losing, they'd also found strength they didn't know they had. Found that the heart was more resilient than they had imagined. Found that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions if tended with patience and courage. On a spring morning 2 years after that blizzard brought them together, Sarah stood at her studio window watching Jacob work in the garden. The mountains rose eternal around them, the same peaks that had nearly claimed her life, now standing guard over the home they'd built. She touched the locket at her throat, then placed her hand over her growing belly, feeling the flutter of new life. She hadn't told Jacob yet. Wanted to find the perfect moment, the right words. But watching him now, seeing the peace in his movements, the contentment that had replaced his old wariness, she knew the moment was now. She went out to join him, and when he looked up and saw her face, he knew immediately that something had changed. "Sarah?" She took his hand and placed it over her belly. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply. Jacob's face transformed, joy and fear and wonder all mixing together. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She watched emotions play across his face, knowing he was thinking of Lucy, of the child he'd lost. "Jacob, this doesn't replace her. Nothing ever could, but maybe it's another chapter," he finished, pulling her close. "Another story in the book." They stood there in the garden, surrounded by new growth, holding each other and the promise of the future. And if both of them cried, it was for joy and sorrow mixed together, for all they'd lost and all they'd found, for the journey that had brought them here. Some moments in life come down to a single choice: to reach out or let go, to trust or turn away, to risk everything for the chance at something real. Sarah Cole had made that choice in a blizzard, taking the hand of a stranger when death seemed certain. Jacob Stern had made that choice too, extending that hand, choosing connection over isolation. And from that single moment of courage, from two broken hearts willing to try again, a life had grown. Not a perfect life. They still had hard days, moments of grief, memories that brought tears. But a good life, built on honesty and hard work and the kind of love that comes from truly seeing each other, scars and all. The mountains stood witness to their story, holding it in the winter snow and spring thaw, in the summer warmth and autumn colors. And if sometimes travelers found shelter in a cave on the mountain pass, they might notice supplies carefully stocked, firewood neatly stacked, the legacy of a man who'd once been saved there and wanted to pay that gift forward. Because that's what love does. It reaches back to honor the past and forward to build the future. It saves and is saved. It takes the hand extended and offers one in return. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it gives you a second chance to live fully, to love deeply, to become the person you were meant to be all along. Sarah and Jacob had found that chance in the most unlikely place, in the most desperate moment, and they'd built something beautiful from it. Something worth surviving for. Something worth the journey.